I think we'll go ahead and get started here. Now, welcome to CSIS. Good morning. My name is Connor Savoy. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Global Innovation Fund, and I'm also a Senior Associate here at CSIS. Our panel this morning is titled Creating a Domestic Consensus on Development, and I'm joined by Liz Schreier, President and Founder of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, Tom Kelly, who is the Counselor for Development at the British Embassy here in Washington, Otto Graft, who is a counselor in the economic section at the German Embassy, and Nakazawa-san, who currently is the Director General for South Asia in Tokyo for JICA, but formerly was JICA's rep here in the United States. So thanks to everybody for joining me this morning, and thanks to all of you. So creating a domestic consensus on development. Why are we doing this year? I think that, as most of you know, we've seen a number of broad forces emerge over the last several years in the United States, in Western Europe, whether it's nationalism or populism, even in some cases what I think we can really term anti-democratic forces. And they are openly questioning the value of the rules-based system that stood the test of time for the past 70 years. Outside of our countries, I think you have a number of powers, such as Russia, such as China, who are either seeking to revise what we have broadly accepted as the Cold War settlement in the case of Russia, or who are now rising to power like China, who want to create their own rules or create their own system. In the West, I think this confluence of issues has contributed to a deep questioning by a number of politicians and their supporters on the value of things like free trade, international institutions like the World Bank or the WTO or the UN system. And this has really resulted in some very interesting political developments. In our country, in the United States, we saw the election of Donald Trump, who ran on an America First agenda. In the UK, you saw the Brexit vote with the people voting to leave the European Union. And on the continent, you've seen parties like the AfD in Germany get elected for the first time to the Bundestag. At the same time, we're facing some of the biggest challenges I think the international system has seen in the last 20 or 30 years. You have the Syrian civil war that threatens to turn into a regional conflict. You have the largest number of people on the move since the end of World War II. Somewhere between 65 or 70 million people are either migrants, refugees, or internally displaced persons. And you have the potential for the first time in a long time for great power conflict in a number of these areas. Domestically, this has caused many to question the value of foreign aid. And that's one of the things that's what we want to focus this panel on today. And the question really in a lot of these folks' minds is, with so many problems at home, why are we focused on problems abroad when we should be focused on fixing problems at home? Why are we sending money abroad when that money could be spent here? Regardless of how much it accounts for as a percentage of the U.S. budget, it's less than 1%. Most other countries, it's similar. And these are valid questions to ask. But I think we also should remember that they're not necessarily new questions. In the United States, for instance, we've long questioned this value. During the 1940s, you had many senators and congressmen who questioned whether we needed to do the Marshall Plan. But I think as we observe the 70th anniversary of General Marshall's speech at Harvard, where he outlined what became known as the Marshall Plan, I think it's timely to reflect upon what has aid and development brought us? What value has this brought us, and what over the past 20 years has this given the broader international system, but also our countries individually? I'm joined today by this distinguished panel who know far more about this than I do, and I think this is a good time to remind ourselves that, is it as dire as we all see it? How can we really renew and refresh this consensus around development spending? So Liz, I think let's start with you. When you think about USGLC spends a lot of time talking to folks on the Hill, but also going out into the country, into the Midwest, into the South, into the far West, not the coasts, but you spend some time on the coasts too. to really talk to people about the value of aid. And so I think it'd be great for you to reflect on how has the U.S. government traditionally thought about foreign aid spending and what does it give us? And then when you go out and talk to people, how do you talk about this value proposition?
Great. Well, first, first is thank you, Connor, for putting this together for CSIS, and so honored to be with the esteemed panel. I'm reminded when you asked the question of that campaign which said it was the economy, stupid, and when you think of the question, I think, it's in our interest, stupid, because to me, it just feels so obvious, why foreign aid, it's in our interest, and I think about that famous quote that everybody says over and over again when you're in our space, which is then General Jim Mattis, when he was asked at a hearing at the Senate Armed Services Committee, should we cut State Department foreign aid and USAID? And he says, if you cut State Department funding, I will need more ammunition. And at the time, he was head of CENTCOM. And it's every general and admiral who keeps saying that. Then Secretary of Defense Bob Gates said development is a lot cheaper than sending in soldiers. And we see, I just saw about earlier this year, our current CENTCOM commander, General Votel, goes to Raqqa, and who does he bring with him? The head of USAID, Mark Green, and they stand there together, and General Votel says, now we, the military, have cleared out the ISIS, and now the hard part starts. And he turns to Mark Green, head of USAID, and says, now you need to come in and really do the hard part, get electricity back, get water back, clear the way so people will come back. And that's the story of it's in our interest, and that's the why, a big part of the why. And when I said, it's in our interest, stupid, people aren't stupid around this country. We just have to make the connection. And what we have to do is make the connection as to how it's in people's interests. Because it's, as Marco Rubio, senator from Florida, said, this foreign aid, it's not charity. This 1% is in our national security. And I'm always reminded when I go out to speak, is one of the things that I really do is try to make this connection of something that Ronald Reagan did. He was the king of that peace through strength, and so many people always took it, and we saw everybody kind of run on it at the Republican Party in 2016, a peace through strength, and talked about the military. But he was the high watermark of foreign assistance because he knew you needed both levers. So it goes to the second part of your question, how do you then tell the story out around the country? So I travel, I do the coast, but I largely go to Appleton, Wisconsin. I was just there on Tuesday. Next week I'm going to Dayton, Ohio, and I go to Erie, Pennsylvania. I'm going to Pontiac, Michigan, and I'm going right into the belly of the beast of where people in this country, I think, still believe we need to be engaged in the world, but they're really questioning how we benefit. And what we really need to do is talk about, not only is it in our national security, but it's also in our economic security. It's always the right thing to do. We are so proud as Americans to be that shiny city on the hill. It's in our national security. We have to listen to our generals and our military experts. But how do we talk about it from an economic standpoint? There's factoids that we at CSIS and in the wonky community can talk about. 95% of Americans, of consumers in the world live overseas. 11 of the 15 best export trading partners of ours were once foreign aid recipients. Well, when I go out and I say that in Appleton, Wisconsin, this happens. But when I go out and I talk about, is America being left behind? You go and look at what China, for example, is doing. When their One Belt, One Road initiative is 7 times that of the Marshall Plan you mentioned, that they're spending $20 billion on ports around the world. When in Africa alone, they, in the last decade, put 700% increase in their development aid. And we had a proposal that was going, luckily it wasn't supported by Congress in a bipartisan way, but would have cut 32% of our international affairs budget, and Congress said, no way, we're not going to do it, and stop that. So we have to ask, are we being left behind, and are we using all the tools of our toolkit? And that starts to change the conversation around the country. And I'll end with this last story, which is when I was in Appleton, Wisconsin a week and a half ago, and I went with a young freshman congressman named Mike Gallagher, who's 34 years old and has a resume that probably is better than all of us up here. 7 years Marine, a PhD from Georgetown. He's unbelievable, and it's his district. And the first question I got when I opened up the conversation was from a manufacturer. And this was the conversation that we started to have is, are we using all the tools of our toolkit? And the first thing I started talking about in the proper language is the BUILD Act. Now, you didn't know what the BUILD Act was. He's not dumb by any means. He's a very successful businessman. But started to talk about, here is a tool of development finance and how it could make a difference to enhance it. And the heads start to nod. And people start to get, yeah, we could be doing more to make a difference. And I think that's the answer.
Thanks, Liz. No, I think that's really spot on. I think one of the things that I'm going to pick up on something you said, and you mentioned how 11 of our top 15 trading partners are former recipients of aid, and I think it bears noting that the 3 countries that are represented here, Germany, the UK, and Japan, were all also once recipients of foreign aid, and now are 3 of the largest donors in the world alongside of us and are close allies, whether from actually in combat or in treaty situations. So when you've gone out and talked to folks, do you find that resonates beyond just the economics, but the sort of broader political and security conversation that you have with, does that resonate with folks as
And
well?
it definitely does now, because part of the America First paradigm that we're in is that America first, but not America alone. And I think that one of the things that's happening is there is a segment, there's always been, as you said, Connor, there's always been a segment of the American population who, I don't, if you want to use the word isolationism, but there's a small segment of our population that, they really think we should kind of really, really focus on. Then there's a segment of our population that's very international, very engaged, but a lot of this country, we'll never see Raqqa, we'll never see, Kenya, we'll never see Tanzania. Their travel is maybe going to Toronto, maybe going over the border to Mexico. A lot of our fellow citizens do not travel anywhere near like the people in this room. And so the idea that my fellow panelists are from countries that, yes, were once foreign recipients, but more importantly today are part of a structure of common good in helping stabilize the world when there's 30 million people suffering from famine, that we as Americans are not the only ones participating, but they're right there with us participating. That's really, really important. And I think the president using that part of the bully pulpit, it's very important that we can tell a story is that we're in this together. Now, we also have to tell the story that this is not just doing good, helping those that are suffering. That's something we as Americans, I think all 4 of our countries are right there in that. But an example is, these are 4, I have to also go out and tell the story, these are 4 countries, Yemen, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, that harbor terrorists. And we have to explain how that may hurt. We have to talk about Yemen. Here's a country that now is a breeding ground potentially for an infectious disease that can be at our border. So we have to make all of those arguments and make it stick and feel like, oh, this does have a connection to me. But yes, I absolutely believe the partnerships that we share, as well as the competition that we share, and I'll tell you one last argument, is when I say it's not just China, but these guys are out there playing, and we want to compete in the world fairly, and when we compete, Americans do okay. So that helps too.
Thanks, Liz. I think that's a good segue to the rest of our panel. Nakazawa-san, you've had a long career with JICA, and you were here for a number of years. We got to know you. Thanks for being here again, and good to see you. Can you talk a little bit about how Japan, one of our closest allies, once a recipient of U.S. aid, once an enemy of the United States, how has Japan traditionally justified aid? How have they approached it?
Thank you, Kona, and I also would like to thank CSIS for kind invitation. In a broad sense, public opinion of Japan does drive the Japanese foreign assistance policy, and that's the exact influence on the justification we make. So tracing the history of ODA Charter, decided by the Cabinet of Japan as a foundation of our ODA policy, and we have the annual public opinion survey on diplomacy, which has some questions about international development cooperation. Those could give us a hint how we should justify the foreign assistance and how we have in fact justified the foreign assistance. The first ODA Charter approved in 1992 proclaimed that to maintain a peaceful and prosperous world, it is an important duty for Japan to assume a role proportionate to its national strength. It was a time when Japanese economy was very strong, and the U.S. had trade war with Japan, not with China. During this period, according to the public opinion survey, the Japanese citizens perceived the purpose behind the ODA as the important contribution as part of being good global citizens, such as it being a humanitarian obligation, international responsibility, or the view that it is in the interest of everyone to have the stable developing countries and the world peace. However, the narrative had to be changed during the protracted mess in the Japanese economy and under severe fiscal conditions. In fact, the revision of the ODA Charter in 2003, and the establishment of the Development Cooperation Charter in 2015 were discussed under strong sense that the public understanding and the public support for ODA was desperately needed. When the Development Cooperation Charter was discussed in 2014, a panel of intellectuals from the private sector, NGO, CSO, academia, and mass media held 4 meetings and gave recommendations to the government, followed by discussion sessions with NGOs and CSOs in 4 major cities throughout Japan. Solicitation of public comments via email and fax followed, and public hearings again in the 4 major cities in Japan followed. So I would say that the lengthy process of establishing this Development Cooperation Charter itself was very important occasions to enhance public understanding and to find justifications for foreign assistance. And if I turn my eyes back to the annual survey, we notice that recent supporters of ODA placed more importance on the local benefits that ODA can bring, in addition to its global benefits and the benefits for developing countries. Now people view ODA as an important tool to increase the international community's confidence in Japan, contribute to securing Japan's stable energy supplies, and enhance the Japanese economy by expanding the footprint of Japanese companies overseas. Accordingly, the government justification for ODA has been changed.
Thanks, Nakazawa-san. When you think about, you said the justification has changed. What role has the rise of China and East Asia played in driving Japan's ODA policy or changes, or has it at all? And how are you thinking about, let's not say countering, but perhaps managing that rise, especially through things like Belt and Road and some of the other large initiatives?
The change in the global balance of power and so-called multipolarization, due partly to the rise of China, I think has strengthened our sense that Japan should lead the international community by contributing to securing peace, stability, and prosperity. So proactive contribution to peace based on the principle of international cooperation, is one of the key concepts, recognizing such severe international environment. And toward this end, our government promotes strategic and effective development cooperation to advance its foreign policy, including the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And Japan has been strengthening strategic collaboration with India, as well as the US and Australia, to make this strategy into shapes. So I would say that protection and promotion of the free and open Indo-Pacific would be additional justification looking at the change of the world, the rise of China, and so on.
Thanks so much. Tom, I think you have the distinction of representing one of the donors that has seen a rather large increase over the last several years. When Prime Minister Cameron came into office, he committed, and it's now enshrined in legislation, that the UK would meet the 0.7, not 0.7 commitment of GNI toward ODA spending. Can you talk a little bit about why that decision went forward? What about the changing world? And then how has the UK kind of looked at using that to balance other forms of power, whether it's defense or diplomacy?
Okay, thank you, Connor, for inviting me here. I think the way the question is posed in the paper suggests that the Cameron government prioritized aid over other aspects of government spending. And I think that the Cameron government, and I think going back to 1997, the Labour government, and I'll speak about that in a minute, I think they would say that that's a false choice, that it's not a question of spending more on development and less elsewhere. It's a question of maintaining commitments to spend both on, if you want to call it soft power, development commitments, and hard power, which is why the UK will often say in the same sentence that we have committed to 0.7% of GNI on aid, and we have also committed to 2% NATO spending on defense. So it's no coincidence that those two statistics are often mentioned in the same sentence, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I think in terms of the 0.7 target, the first time the UK met that was in 2013. There is an International Aid Act, which was passed in 2015 in the UK Parliament, which mandates the UK government to spend at least 0.7% on aid. And if the UK doesn't spend 0.7% on aid, then the Secretary of State has to come to Parliament and explain why she hasn't spent that amount of money. But I think those two commitments, I think you have to look way back to 1997 and see a historical trend of commitment to aid across all stripes of government in the UK. I work in DFID, the government department that was created in 1997 with a specific focus on alleviating and eradicating extreme poverty. So before that, it used to be part of the Foreign Office. And that meant that the government before 1997 was looking at aid in terms of trade, tied trade agreements, explicit foreign policy goals. I mean, nature comes round in circles, I'll come back to that again, but a government department was created with a cabinet seat and in government, talking to the Prime Minister every week at cabinet about specifically development issues. 2000, we had the Millennium Summit, a focus on the MDGs. The Labour government again said, yes, we commit to the MDGs, and that means spending a lot more money on aid. 2005, still a Labour government, we had the Gleneagle Summit in Scotland on aid. Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, the Chancellor, totally committed to aid. The Finance Minister saying, yes, we need to put much more money into aid, a doubling of aid to Africa, commitment, that happened. And then in 2010, if you look at all the three major political parties in the UK, this is an important point, every one of them had manifesto commitments to commit 0.7% to aid. So the point I'm making here is that for the last 20 years, you've had a strong parliamentary cross-border, cross-bench support for aid. It's not just been the Cameron government. And that's quite remarkable in the UK at a time of fiscal austerity. The banks had to be bailed out in 2008. Huge amounts of money. Cuts in domestic spending. The only two areas of UK government spending that the government said would not be cut would be the National Health Service and DFID. The minister at the time, Conservative minister, said that we won't balance the books on the backs of the very poorest, which again is a commitment to keeping promises that the UK government had said it would do on aid. The second aspect of this answer, I think, is to go back to what Liz said. I mean, I think the UK government would say it's not just about helping people, although there's a strong moral case to help people, but you have to look at what poverty reduction means in a more comprehensive sense. David Cameron was asked by the Secretary General to be a co-chair of the post-2015 settlement, which gave us the SDGs. He was pushing very much for SDG 16, which focuses on justice, security, strong institutions. And that was foreshadowing what DFID is doing, commits to doing, and is doing right now, is focusing an increasing proportion of aid in fragile states. So right now, DFID spends half of its budget in insecure environments. And we know that by 2030, all the analysis shows us that by 2030, 80% of the poorest people will be living in these countries. So it's not just about helping people, although there's a strong moral case to do that. I won't repeat what Liz said about if you don't help countries that are experiencing outbreaks of pandemics. The Ebola outbreak is a good example. If you don't do something and use your aid and other instruments, the military as well, in appropriate circumstances, then that's going to be a problem that you will soon address. So I won't repeat those points, but those are that aspect of aid in a broader national security context is one that the UK government would strongly sign up to. The Secretary of State last week in London just gave a speech which sets out a new offer on development. I think that underlines those broader national security and national prosperity objectives. And I think she's making that point because the UK has committed to 0.7%, and there's big questions in the UK among some aspects of the population. Well, what do we get back for that? We understand the humanitarian context, we understand the need to support health and education. Where's the payback for the UK taxpayer? The other part of this question says, how does the UK government manage issues that arise from the Daily Mail effect? For people that don't know, the Daily Mail is a newspaper in the UK, right of centre, extremely critical on aid, basically at the vanguard of criticisms of why so much money is being spent on aid. I think the government has taken two approaches to that. In DFID, anybody who works in DFID every day understands the amount of scrutiny that the aid program is under, and that's led to a huge focus on not just what the inputs are, but what the results are and the outcomes. That explains a bilateral aid review and a multilateral aid review that took place in 2013 and 2016. Upset some agencies. We pulled out of some UN agencies as a result of the first multilateral aid review. We made big decisions as a result of the last one to tie 30% of core funding dependent on performance and outcomes. So a much more conditional approach. So the money's still on the table, but it's not a blank check, and there's a focus, just as the same on the bilateral program, on multilateral outcomes and what we can actually show we're getting for it. A huge push on transparency. Everything that DFID spends more than £500 on now is on the website. So a real focus on value for money that goes all the way from the UN contributions to what DFID is spending on much smaller programs. 0.7% on aid means that 99.3% of government spending isn't going on aid, but that doesn't matter when you've got newspapers asking questions every day, why are we spending 0.7% on aid and why are we the only G7 country to do so? What that means is that the government has taken, I think over the past 12 months, a much more proactive approach to explaining to people why the 0.7 commitment makes sense and why it makes sense to continue spending that much money. What that means is it's more on the front foot now, getting messages out about what aid is doing. And what research in the UK shows, I'll finish on this point, is that you can roughly segment the population into three areas. A third of the people will get the case for aid and totally support it. A third of the people are against it, and there's not much you can do to change their mind. And a third of the people are what the researchers call marginally engaged. So they're open to hearing the arguments. And the government is trying to push a positive, constructive message for aid, so that people understand that it's not just about doing good for poor people. There's a wider set of issues there, and it's a comprehensive approach that the government's pushing.
Thanks, Tom. I think you made a very good point about it wasn't just. I think we often think it's just in the context of Cameron coming into office, but there is a deeper cross-party, cross-bench support for aid in the UK context, and it's something to behold. I think it's great that exists in your context. I think we have had a stronger or tougher time recently to have something similar, but Liz,
Can I just add one point?
Yeah.
You know, it was your very last point about a third. I think that has a lot of similarities in the U.S. about that same third.
And I think that's something that we don't always remember, is that there are more people here who understand it, and there's a decent segment of the population that you can actually bring around
Absolutely.
to understanding this in both contexts. Otto, maybe I'll go to you now. How is, you represent Germany here in the United States. How has Germany traditionally approached foreign aid? You are one of the largest donors in the world. And then maybe think about, you're dealing with the refugee crisis. You're one of the major recipients of refugees from a per capita basis in Europe, and it's obviously having an effect on politics. Is that spilling over into how Germany is approaching foreign aid at this point? Press the.
Okay, thank you, Connor. I think when one is talking about the acceptance of foreign assistance in Germany, one has to look back just after World War II, when Germany received help through the Marshall Plan, which I think set the stage for German activities in the field of foreign assistance. So from the very beginning, this was a very accepted concept in Germany, and the first German contributions date back to the early 1950s, when Germany supported some United Nations programs. But then it took a while till we had our own Ministry of Foreign Assistance, which was in 1961. And since then, we went through several policy changes. In the beginning, it was just the idea of growth. Then it was the idea of the eradication of poverty. Then we finally got an idea we have to also look at markets, see at political structures, trying to influence them to the good. And then we had all these sustainability issues culminating then in the SDGs. And over all these years, there was not really a change in acceptance of foreign assistance. I think the real conceptual changes happened in 2015. This was the year of the refugee crisis, but we had actually two sides of the changes. The one was the planned changes, which coincidentally were also in the same year, and then of course we had the effects of the refugee crisis. In the analysis till this year developed to a point where we said, okay, our foreign policy also have to have means. This was the famous sentence of our foreign minister then, Mr. Steinmeier, who said we need a foreign policy with means. And so we suddenly stepped up the budget of the foreign ministry to be active in the fields what we call stabilization, which is of course also in a way connected to foreign assistance and to development assistance. And from this point of time, we are really seeing the package of foreign policy, of defense and security policy, and development assistance, which was not seen so clearly before, I would say. But since then, we really have this idea that they somehow belong together. Not talking about what is afterwards a counter for ODA and whatnot, which would be a seminar probably of a week to understand that fully, what's counting to it and what not. And the other thing that happened, of course, in 2015 was the what we call refugee crisis. So around 1 million people came into Germany. The official figure now is 890,000. Some others say 1.1 million. I think this is not really the point. The point is that it was very obvious that Europe, Germany is directly affected by what goes on in our immediate neighborhood, which is of course the MENA region, which always had a lot of political attention, and then Africa, which somehow had faded in attention over the years. I mean, there were always a lot of programs we had in Africa, but they were not as successful as envisaged, and so also the emphasis of this continent was not so strong. And this changed completely in 2015, and since then we have the situation that that foreign assistance, foreign aid is also perceived as being in the interest of Germany, which is a new thing. Before that it was just seen as an altruistic endeavor, but it was not really fully understood that it's also in our own interest, and that we also have to think what we can achieve with limited funds. And the analysis is that in many cases with the money we have, we can do more good if we are closer to the problem than farther away from the problem. And I think this has now the discussion is going into this direction, and the discussion what we are seeing in Germany is less so do we need foreign assistance. The discussion is more going into a direction, are we efficient enough? This is how I would summarize the discussion in Germany.
Thanks, Otto. That's great. I think one thing we're going to turn to audience Q&A in a second, but one thing that I wanted to pull out from this conversation is I think all of you have emphasized in your own country context, we talk about the 3 Ds here, of course, defense, development, and diplomacy, but I think what's often lost is that this isn't just us who are thinking about this. It's clearly something that our ally governments think about, and you know, I think one thing for us in the U.S. context is to think really about how we talk about the partnership that exists, because I think too often it ends up in this caricature of us supporting everybody around the world, not just folks in the developing world, but our allies in NATO, our allies in East Asia as well. Liz, when you this is just a short question before we turn to the audience. I think do people, when you talk to folks out, do people see that value? Do people understand that the allies play a role and they don't fall back on this sort of trope of we're propping everyone up and we're paying for everything?
I think the answer is yes and no. You know, I think that the, you know, it goes back to the third. There is I haven't done polling on this, so don't hold me to the numbers, but if I had to guess, I think that there are, you know, 2/3 of this country approximately who, yes, you know, who see the value of an international order of engagement of, you know, not only the countries that are represented up here, but a broader international order that has worked together to engage in the world. But I think part of what we have seen in the last couple of years is this questioning of, is that, you know, is that what this is all about? And has everybody helped do their fair share? And I think when you looked at the, you know, go back to the original, one of the first salvoes of the president on the international order was this questioning of NATO. And so this wasn't foreign aid per se, but it was around NATO, and the question was, are you doing enough? Now, lots of presidents had said, are you paying your fair share? But this was a pretty rough questioning of that. And I think it resonated with elements of the American public. So when I go out, I don't hear as much of that, but I think that there is, that touched a nerve in the American public. And I think if we're, for all of our countries, I think Tom spoke to it most directly, but I think that if we want to turn the tide and go back to a place where there is a robust support and engagement for foreign aid in all of our countries, that we have to recognize that we have to be talking about that there are countries across the board that are committed to helping, you know, relieve poverty, engage those in need. The 80% of those in poverty are in conflict zones, and why that engagement is in the world's interest. And I think we have to make that case and make sure it's sticky. Using a very, very, you know, high-tech word.
Yes. Couldn't agree more. So let's go to the audience. There's a lot of folks here. Please raise your hand, identify yourself, and if we can, keep it to a shortish question. The lady in the back, and then this gentleman right up here. And we're going to group them.
Hi, my name is Liz. I'm with Core Africa, which is a private effort to create an African Peace Corps program. And you touched on it a little bit, Connor, in your last question about working in partnership. And I wanted to ask your take on USAID's new emphasis on transitioning away from dependence on outside aid. So we're not just talking about outsiders doing their part, but from inside, including promoting local philanthropy, but also owning their own development and doing it themselves.
Could you just repeat the last part? We didn't hear that.
In terms of owning their own, increasing promoting a culture of philanthropy within these developing countries. Even the poorest countries have elite communities who don't donate because that's what outsiders do. But also just having ownership of the development happening.
Thanks so much. And then this gentleman up here, let's do two together.
My name is Miguel Schloss. I'm from Chile, a country that collapsed in the early 70s, undertook major reforms then, and since the last 40 years it has been developing at a fairly decent clip, moving from one of the poorest countries in Latin America to one of the highest per capita income. I asked a member of the reform group, what was the biggest lesson learned out of this collapse and then rebirth? He's a very moderate man, I should say, and at the risk of sounding a little bit iconoclastic, he said, you know something, with the benefit of hindsight, the best thing that happened to us is that we became an international pariah in the times of our dictatorship. For the first time, the World Bank didn't come, the IMF didn't come, and for the first time we had to deal with our own problems and pull ourselves through our own bootstraps. It's not that we didn't know what to do, it's that with their assistance, we would have done these adjustment programs, we would have continued limping along, trying to show that we made progress, but we would have stayed where we were. I'm not saying that foreign assistance is bad. What I'm saying is that there is an issue, and it bothers me when I come here to Washington from time to time and hear this discussion, very supply-driven. What is the aim? So many billions, moving from the billions to the trillions, and having this and that goal. Whose goal is it? The goal is of the country, not of you. And many of you don't even have experience in development. You have developed a long time ago, and you are rather stable countries. JICA has done something interesting, and you are an exception in some respects. You have an office in Chile, which for the first time does reverse technical assistance. They are coming to Chile to seek local expertise in order to help other countries. The World Bank is starting something similar. What I think in general, I would say, the questioning that is taking place in these countries is welcome, it is helpful. Hopefully you do something useful with it to reorient attention towards impact. Results there, not here.
Thank you.
I'd love to.
Yeah,
combine
yeah.
the two.
Thanks so much. So yeah, why don't Liz? Do you want to?
I think I can
make a
combine the
comment?
two
Yeah.
together because I think they go along. I mean, I think they're both fabulous questions. You know, one of the things that's part of our DNA is, you know, aid has to, and I think everybody will agree with this, it's got to be effective. It's not just about dollars in. It's got to be results driven. And I think that's, you know, I go back and I talk to politicians a lot, and one of the things I talk with them about is you go back, at least for the U.S., to, you know, to President George Bush, who was the first, you know, administration, you know, post 9/11, who said, you know, we got to stop looking at inputs. We got to look at outputs, and how do you make sure these are results driven? And we started a trajectory of really changing reform. So where are we today? Where is Mark Green has to pick up the baton of aid director to aid director, and where are we? And if you all know the stats, if we were sitting here from the U.S., you know, 50 years ago, we would be talking about 90% of the capital flows coming from U.S. government, and today it's 10%. So the question that Mark is asking, which is what the woman in the back is exactly right on, and your question as well, is that if 10%, then how do you use that, you know, $1 out of $10 that is U.S. government to use it smartly to clear the way for private sector dollars going in. And that means really talking to the governments, really talking to those on the ground to make sure that we do something with our, that the private sector isn't going to do. So that means dealing with corruption, dealing with rule of law, doing with infrastructure, doing the things that if you do them right, you really help those, the locals, clear the way, and we can go on and talk about that's where the development finance efforts really make a difference. I see some of the NGOs in the world. I see some in the room, some of the private sector folks that I know that are in the room. And I think the reform of the future, yes, we all hope that the goal is for countries to take ownership and run with it. I don't know anybody, I don't know people in the aid community, maybe you do, but I don't, that don't believe that the goal is to get out of there. I'm sure maybe there are, but I think that's what everybody wants. So the question of today, which is probably different, I teach a class where I teach about the history of aid. Madeline Albright teaches a class at Georgetown called the National Security Toolkit, and I teach one of her classes on the history of aid. So I looked at this, and the original aid was a different story. But the aid of today is about how do you use our tools to catalyze and leverage private sector, whether it's in the nonprofit or the for-profit arena, to do exactly what this woman in the back did and exactly what you're talking about. Do we get it right all the time? No way. But are we trying to get it right? Absolutely. And I think that's what this conference is all about, is really thinking about how do you get it right.
I think it's absolutely right. Tom Otto Nakazawa-san, do you want to reflect on that, or?
No, I was just going to bring up this point of development finance. The UK has put a lot of money into the CDC in the UK, overseas, focused on the poorest countries in Africa and Asia, to do exactly that, to make sure that aid is not crowding out the private sector, to encourage private sector investment by reducing risk, so that we can get onto a path where aid is no longer required in these countries. So that's what the UK development objective is, because, not to repeat myself, but it's not in countries that are middle-income country where aid is needed, it's in the fragile states. By 2030, 80% of the poorest are going to be not living in these middle-income countries where the private sector is working. So what do we do about that? So completely agree with you. We should not be crowding out the private sector or doing things that other people can do better than us. And I think if you look at the profile of ODA over the past 10, 15 years, you'll see it's gone down dramatically, and private finance instruments have gone up. And that's something that the UK government wants to work with other donors to make sure we're pushing in that direction.
I think one of the basic principles of the Japanese foreign assistance policy is a request first basis, and I'm very proud that JICA has contributed somehow in Chile's becoming the big exporter of salmon. That was based upon Chile's government request to Japanese government to help growing the salmon industry in Chile. And I think looking back the Japanese experience, Japan was collapsed 70 years ago, and returned to become developed countries, and we put a very high importance upon human resource development and infrastructure with the sound macro economic management. Those are the kind of key which we would like to deliver to Southeast Asian countries, South Asian countries, and now try to promote Africa as well.
Did you want to?
Yes, I just would like to emphasize what already has been said, that I think we shouldn't use an either-or approach, but I think we need both. We just have to be clever to use the right tool for the right job, and if we are seeing fragile countries that are coming out of a conflict, I think official development assistance, whether we call it stabilization or foreign assistance or whatever, will be needed, because there are no means in these countries in general that allows them to fix their problems by themselves, and also a private investor or a bank would not want to touch it. And then, of course, once we have a certain level of development, then of course it's often more wise to pull out and leave the stage to the local actors.
Yeah, I would just add on the transition thing. I think when you look at what Administrator Green is trying to do with this. It is a recognition that there is so much more capacity in many of these countries, and it can't just be the sort of chicken or beef foreign aid, proposition that we've had for a long time, and there are a lot of other tools. Liz touched on the development finance, but there's also just the sort of broader trade, investment, but also scientific exchanges, training, however you want to look at it. There is so much that relationship needs to change, and a lot of that is a demand-driven argument. I think if you look at one of the principles of the transition strategy that they're putting together is to rely more on domestic resources, on domestic resource mobilization, local government revenue, recognition that there's so many more local resources. We often talk about all the private investment that flows into emerging market countries, but there's also this other pool of domestic resources that can help fund their own development that isn't reliant on aid. And that's really a demand-driven proposition. If you go back to the Addis Ababa Financing for Development Conference, that was responding really to a call from those countries to help improve their systems to allow them to better fund their own development. But yeah, let's go to another round of questions. There's a gentleman in the back here and this woman right up here in the white, and this gentleman standing in the back.
Jim Roberts, Heritage Foundation. The Overseas Private Investment Corporation right now does most of its lending to lower middle and upper middle income countries and not to low income countries. And the proposals in Congress right now would not fix that. And also, they would allow lending to upper middle income countries, which sometimes have their own foreign aid programs. And yet those countries would be borrowing money from U.S. taxpayer subsidy loans to fix problems that they really haven't prioritized themselves. So shouldn't the legislation on the Hill be amended to focus only on low-income countries?
We'll take one more. Yeah, thanks.
Hello, thank you. My name is Astrid Ruiz. I'm from the private sector. I have a small U.S. company focused on economic development in the U.S. and in West Africa. I've lived in West Africa and worked in international development for over 10 years. Once upon a time, foreign assistance was focused on promoting democracy through development. Today, I don't hear that concept even mentioned. Today, it's the 3Ds, the defense, development, democracy, diplomacy. What has happened to, so if you look at U.S. foreign assistance, the U.S. used to be a leader in promoting democracy. Over the last decade and a half, we see that democracy has actually regressed throughout the world, and perhaps even in the U.S. So how can we ensure that the billions that have to be translated into trillions actually serve inclusive development that align with nonpartisan objectives for development that supports democracy and not just very specific and partisan objectives?
Great, thanks. So I'm happy to answer the first question on the legislation that's before. I think it's an excellent question, and it does get to the heart of the idea of the Development Finance Institution and how much emphasis is actually on development and where is it working. And you're right, if you look at the portfolio of OPIC or at IFC at the World Bank, a lot of it is concentrated in upper middle income or lower middle income countries. And there is a lot of questioning about whether that is actually, are you getting your biggest bang for the buck here, especially in the countries where perhaps they can tap the international capital markets or local finance for what they're doing. I think if you actually look at the BUILD Act that has been introduced, it does have a strong preference for its financing to go to lower income and lower middle income countries. There is a language in the bill that would allow it to make financing available in upper middle income or middle income countries under two circumstances. One, the national security waiver, or two, demonstration of high development impact in a region of that country that still has a large concentration of poverty. So I wouldn't say that that doesn't exist in the legislation. I think it strongly suggests that the preference of Congress is that the new DFC would operate in lower income or lower middle income countries, which I would say lower middle income countries still often face many of the same challenges from a private sector financing perspective. I was talking to an entrepreneur from Nigeria the other day, and he recently got a loan of working capital from a Nigerian bank at 5% interest. And I said, oh, that seems very low for Nigeria. I said, what's the regular commercial rate? And he said 20%. So, while he did get that financing, he has also gotten financing from DFIs who, again, are giving him a better rate than whatever, at 20% we would, I think, all agree is bordering on usury in some cases. So, again, I think I think the preference has been stated by Congress very strongly. I think it is then incumbent, if this legislation is passed, it's incumbent on them to ensure that that is in fact where the new institution is lending. And my own preference would be that they very clearly hold them to those areas and to avoid as much as possible upper middle income countries where they may not need that financing as much. Liz, do you want?
Ditto. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Who asked? Astrid. Agree. Mark Green came from IRI, which is very focused, as we know, the International Republican Institute, sister organization of the National Democratic Institute, which focuses on democracy building, nonpartisan democracy building programs. Believe me, he is focused on that fourth D. And it is unfortunate that over the last about decade that our democracy programs have not zeroed out, but have diminished. And I think there are a number of us, I would put myself in it. Dan Rundy, who opened up the program today, is very committed to seeing our democracy programs expand and enriched, not diminished. So I think there are a number of reasons. We probably don't have time for them to go into them today, but I think your point is very well taken. I think there is an energy within Congress, both on a bipartisan basis, to enrich and not diminish our, as the United States, efforts to make sure that we play a leadership role in those democracy building efforts, because they have been under attack. We've seen them in many places throughout the world. And I think some of our efforts, not just in election monitoring, but in the civil society building efforts that are so critical throughout the world. So, hear, hear.
So we don't have any more time for any more questions, but Otto and Tom and Nakazawa-san, do you want to perhaps reflect a little bit on this question about democracy promotion, democracy regression, and how your individual institutions deal with this? Because I think the U.S. often is seen as very strong proponent of, or has been in the past, of democracy promotion, and I know other aid agencies are a little bit more skittish in some cases, but would the three of you reflect a little bit on this note, especially on the regression?
Can I just say one thing? The reason it became, just by the way, the 3Ds as opposed to the 4Ds is the first time this even showed up was in the 2002 U.S. National Security Strategy that was written, the first one that was written right after 9/11. Condi Rice was the National Security advisor at the time, and it shows up in our national security strategy as development diplomacy alongside defense, and it became all of a sudden the 3D strategy. And what's so interesting is here is Condoleezza Rice today and throughout her tenure in public office, as well as George W. Bush, who was the president at the time, who is one of the leaders. In fact, today in the Bush Center today, they're giving an award to Bono, and they are having a Bush Center program, and they're one of the leading voices around the issue of democracy building, and have spoken again and again using his platform in his post-presidency around that. And my guess is if they had a chance to go back and rewrite that single sentence in the 2002 National Security Strategy, they would have written 4Ds, not 3 Ds. But that's why it was called the 3Ds.
Gentlemen, do you want to reflect a little bit?
Maybe just one sentence. I think democracy, and if we put it a little bit wider, also the rule of law, I think this is the foundation on which we can expect private investments to happen. And that's why I think we are very well counseled if we are pursuing that, because if there is no rule of law, if there is not certain democratic level in a country, we won't see private investment and the money flowing to these countries. Thank you.
I would just say very, very briefly that, I mean, in the UK context, we support government's own development programs. So that's a fundamental principle of UK support, that we are not going to be doing something that the government themselves don't want to see happen in terms of their own national development plans. And if you look at the sector level in terms of what DFID is supporting, you'll see, in addition to health and education, that a great deal of support goes on democracy and governance programs, election support programs, making sure the third sector, civil society, has a strong voice in discussions around their own national development. So that's something that the UK, I don't think, has moved away from.
You know, as I mentioned, Japan now promotes free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, and where we very much put the emphasis upon the promotion of the rule of law. And for example, I was in Myanmar until last March for 2 years and looked at the transition from semi-military government to the NLD government. And we have several legal experts working at the Supreme Court and also the Attorney General's office of the Myanmar to create an environment that rule of law really works in such a transition country.
Well, thanks, everybody. Thank you to the panelists. Thanks to the audience. I've been asked to let everyone know that lunch will be served right over there in the mezzanine. Please join me in thanking the panel today.